That it was within God's purposes that the Jewish people should have a home back in
There are
Israel.
some, of course, who will say that God has finished with Israel.
Wars and rumors of wars. These are the birth pains of global change.
In doing so, they opened the way for the restoration of the Jewish people to their ancient homeland.
Did God reject his people? By no means. Romans 11, verse 1.
That the destiny of Britain was actually to be the restorer of Israel, the Cyrus nation in the sovereign purposes of God.
Prepare your hearts to receive the blessing of the Cyrus Call. Shalom, I'm Randy Weiss, and I must ask if you believe that God is finished with the Jews. I do not. And this special edition of CrossTalk, in partnership with the Hatikva Film Trust, will be challenging if you reject the notion that God loves the Jewish people. If you are uncertain, I want to hear from you. But consider the presentation fairly before making up your mind. Many non-Jews have heard the call to pray for Israel and to love the Jewish people. In fact, England and Scotland were two of the first nations to recognize God's prophetic plan to restore the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Many countries established consulates in Jerusalem in the mid-1800s, but Jerusalem was still a dark place, suffering from the consequences of sin. Yet God was not done with Israel, and the story of how Protestant believers, such as those in the CMJ, the church's ministry among the Jews, worked toward restoration. This is the Cyrus Call.
Within a couple of decades, every major European power, as well as the Americans, would follow suit and establish consulates here in Jerusalem. The land of Israel was beginning to emerge from centuries of political obscurity. That same year, 1838, CMJ managed to procure land inside the Jaffa Gate, near to the British consular residence. Situated right opposite the citadel that the Romans had preserved in 70 of the Common Era, this became the first piece of Protestant real estate in the land of Israel, even the Middle East. It was clear from this point forward that Britain's official policy in the land of Israel was going to be intertwined with the Jewish people. Britain's Cyrus role to pave the way for the restoration of the Jews to the Promised Land had begun.
In 1839, the Scottish evangelicals joined in. In June that year, a delegation led by the Reverend Robert Murray McShane visited the Promised Land and the Holy City, which, as the Bible had prophesied, had been suffering from centuries of neglect. His journal gives us a vivid picture of the character of Jerusalem at that time.
How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? Is this the perfection of beauty? How hath the Lord covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger? It is indeed very desolate. Read the 2 first chapters of Lamentations, and you will have a vivid picture of our first sight of Jerusalem. I think I'd better not tell you about Jerusalem. The plague is still in Jerusalem. Every night we heard the mourners going about the streets with their dismal wailings for the dead. Zion is ploughed like a field, just as in Micah chapter 3 verse 12. Jerusalem is indeed heaps of ruins. The quantities of rubbish would amaze you, in one place higher than the walls. Judah's cities are all waste.
Upon his return to Scotland, McShane stated in a sermon,
The greatest glory and joy anyone can experience is to be like God. And to care first for the Jews is to be like God. The whole Bible shows that God has a special affection for Israel. There are some, of course, who will say that God has finished with Israel. But the whole Bible contradicts such an idea. Did God reject his people? By no means. Romans 11, verse 1. They will give life to the dead world.
Robert Murray McCheyne's visit to the land of Israel and his subsequent preaching led to a spiritual revival in Scotland. However, it would be another several decades before the Scots would establish a mission field in the Promised Land. Meanwhile, in 1839 and 1840, John Nicolason began developing the CMJ property opposite the citadel, with the ultimate aim of building a church.
CMJ, Shaftesbury, the Church of Scotland, as well as many other Christians in England and even the Times newspaper believed this was the time for the restoration of Israel.
Throughout 1839 and 1840, the Times had published articles and letters by many who were calling for the restoration of the Jewish people to their promised land. Articles included a memorandum by church leaders addressed to Queen Victoria and other heads of state in Europe.
The transformational connection that grew between believers in Great Britain and the yet-to-be restored land of Israel is fundamental to our understanding of the Cyrus Call. Please stay tuned.
CrossTalk International and the Today with God project have been at work here in Cuba now for nearly 10 years. In that time, we've seen over 30,000 people be presented with the message of Christ through Who is Jesus project. And over 5,000 people have given their lives to the Lord for the very first time. Nearly 50 different churches have been planted specifically because of what God is doing through this project. With that influx, we need to support the pastors and their families. We need to help bring in more leadership, and that's where you come in. We have taken on the support of 61 pastors across the island of Cuba, and we'd like to ask your help. For just $50 a month, we can continue to support these pastors. For every gift that is committed, we've got a matching grant, a donor who's committed to double what you give. So your $50 becomes $100, and we can then support 2 pastors. Give us a call at 1-800-688-3422 or visit us online at crosstalk.org.
Check out the all-new IBN television. Follow the move by tuning in as we partner with ministries like Greg Laurie and Harvest America. Serving our audience 24 hours a day, IBN broadcasts on 52 television stations around the country and on popular streaming apps like Roku, Apple TV, Android, and many others, with one purpose: to share the move of our living God with the dying world on a daily basis. IBN Television.
British statesmen, journalists, politicians, and even royalty had come to see the clear meaning of the Holy Bible regarding Israel and the Jewish people. For such a time as this, specific leaders were promoted to positions of authority. God had a plan for his people's restoration through the Cyrus Call.
Their responses were published too.
Let us remember that reading of the Bible formulated British mental makeup and attitude to the Jews in general and to the idea of restoration of Jews to Palestine.
One of the most persistent activists was Anthony Ashley, better known as the Earl of Shaftesbury. In July 1840, he recorded in his diary, "Anxious about the hopes and prospects of the Jewish people, everything seems ripe for their return to Palestine. The way of the kings of the East is prepared. Could the 5 powers of the West be induced to guarantee the security of life and possessions to the Hebrew race, they would now flow back in rapidly augmenting numbers. Then by the blessing of God, I will prepare a document, fortify it by all the evidence I can accumulate, and confiding to the wisdom and mercy of the Almighty, lay it before the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. It just so happened that the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Lord Palmerston, was Shaftesbury's stepfather-in-law.
I would be most grateful if I could have a little of your time to discuss a matter of great concern to me and to others.
Well, of course. Good opportunity.
Oh, thank you. Most grateful.
Shaftesbury later wrote of a meeting he had with Palmerston. Dined with Palmerston. After dinner, left alone with him.
Now, what's on your mind?
I believe the time is ripe for them to return.
Propounded my scheme, which seemed to strike his fancy. He asked some questions and readily promised to consider it.
If the five great powers of the West...
How singular is the order of providence. Singular, that is, if estimated by man's ways.
I think they will flow back.
Palmerston has already been chosen by God to be an instrument of good to his ancient people. To do homage, as it were, to their inheritance, and to recognize their rights without believing their destiny.
Not all in 1 year, of course.
And it seems he will do yet more. But though the motive be kind, it is not sound. I am forced to argue politically, financially, commercially. These considerations strike him home. He weeps not like his master over Jerusalem. Shaftesbury asked Erasmus Scott Calman, who was a CMJ worker from Jerusalem and Jewish believer in Jesus, to prepare a document for Lord Palmerston's information.
Calman himself was born as a Jew, was born in Latvia, I think, and afterwards baptized. But he expanded national Jewish ideas. Amazing. And he was very keen on Jewish settlement in Palestine. And he was man on the spot. He lived in Palestine, but also was over affairs in Eastern Europe. He came from them. And he had the feeling that there is a potential of immigration because of the poverty, because of the persecution of the Jews there, and because of the eternal desire to return to Palestine.
Scott Calman, who had travelled with Robert Murray McShane when he returned to Britain the previous year, concluded his 21-page dissertation to the Foreign Secretary thus.
A proclamation like that of Cyrus would be echoed by hundreds of thousands of Jews in Poland, Russia, and elsewhere, and by the rich as well as by the poor, who would gladly exchange their present harassed and uncertain mode of life for the quiet and more certain one that would result from the cultivation of the soil. They would be enabled to sit under their vine and fig tree, and none should make them afraid. Signed, Erasmus Scott Calman, a Hebrew Christian.
On the 11th of August 1840, a few days after receiving Scott Calman's document, Lord Palmerston wrote to the British ambassador in Constantinople, Lord Ponsonby.
There exists at present among the Jews dispersed over Europe a strong notion that the time is approaching when their nation is to return to Palestine. and consequently their wish to go thither has become more keen, and their thoughts are bent more intently than before upon the means of realizing that wish. It is well known that the Jews of Europe possess great wealth. It would be of manifest importance to the Sultan to encourage the Jews to return to and settle in Palestine. I have to instruct Your Excellency to place these considerations confidentially under the notice of the Turkish government and strongly recommend them to hold out every just encouragement to the Jews of Europe to return to Palestine.
Shaftesbury looked to Palmerston as being the modern Cyrus who would lead the Jewish people back to the land of Israel.
Palmerston tells me he has already written to Lord Ponsonby to direct him to open an intercourse with the Rashid Pasha at Constantinople concerning the protection and encouragement of the Jews. This is a prelude to the antitype of the decree of Cyrus.
In fact, there were many similarities to the period many centuries before when Cyrus, Emperor of the Persians, did permit the Jewish people to return from exile. The similarities were basically geopolitical. On that occasion, Cyrus, the Emperor of the Northern Kingdom, Persia, was fearful lest his rival, the Empire of the South, Egypt, invaded from the south. The best way Cyrus had of protecting his southern flank against such an Egyptian assault was to establish a strong garrison force there. And if a vigorous and sympathetic ally, namely the Jewish people, populated the land, this too would aid him in his geopolitical ambitions. Thus, in the modern period, the British were aiming for nothing different. Great Britain was endeavouring to protect her link to her Eastern Empire from rival claimants, namely France and Russia. However, despite the fact that Palestine did not boast a large population at the time, the Turks were naturally opposed to a strong Jewish presence there, and the plan for the Jewish restoration to Palestine did not happen then. Besides, in 1840, the Jewish people were not ready to be restored to their ancient homeland.
Southwestern Assemblies of God University's School of Business has a vision to make an impact in the lives of students and the world. To be uncommon, you have to look outside the walls of traditional thinking. That is why they reached out to CrossTalk International to work together to develop a plan that teaches students to change the world by actually doing it. Dr. LaSharnda Beckwith of SAGU and SAGU alumni Joshua Weiss of CrossTalk took a group of 10 believers to both India and Sri Lanka and engaged the people in ways that have never been done. The Business for Missions team put their education to practice as they did quality research to develop successful micro-businesses. This team is infusing hope into a people in need. The process of developing these businesses is a 3-year plan that will not only present ideas, but will help implement them and then make sure that they succeed. The team also brought the quality teaching materials of the Today with God project and left tools for the local churches to be empowered to spread the Word of God to the people of India and Sri Lanka. Through the Today with God project, the Business for Missions team gave the opportunity to see, hear, and understand the visual presentation of the gospel message. Together, the Southwestern School of Business and CrossTalk International have provided the tools to be fishers of men, but have also shown how to be fishers of fish. With God's help, they are bettering people's lives in both physical and spiritual ways. And this is only the beginning. Check out the all-new IBN television. Follow the move by tuning in as we partner with ministries like Greg Laurie and Harvest America. Serving our audience 24 hours a day, IBN broadcasts on 52 television stations around the country and on popular streaming apps like Roku, Apple TV, Android, and many others, with one purpose: to share the move of our living God with the dying world on a daily basis. IBN Television.
Cyrus, an ancient pagan king of Persia, was called by God to restore the Jewish people to the land of Israel during the time of the Babylonian exile. This was the original Cyrus Call. England was to be part of Israel's next restoration through a new Cyrus Call.
In late 1840, Britain played a significant part in ousting Egypt from the land of Israel. The King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, thought this an opportune time to establish German interests in Jerusalem. He knew of the existence of the small CMJ property and envisaged this being transformed into a centre of worldwide Protestant union. He proposed the establishment of a Protestant bishopric between the Anglican and German evangelical churches. Palmerston, the Anglican Church, and Queen Victoria all agreed. In late 1841, CMJ was called upon to nominate the Bishop of Jerusalem. They chose a former Jewish rabbi named Michael Solomon Alexander. He left England aboard the HMS Devastation, a gift from the British government for the newly established British initiative in Jerusalem, which had received much international attention. On the 21st of January 1842, Michael Solomon Alexander, the first Protestant bishop in the Middle East, arrived in Jerusalem.
Sending of a bishop to Jerusalem was a very important move in this aspect, meaning, first of all, really opening the way for a real significant Protestant community, and secondly, starting to compete with other groups that already existed here, other communities.
It's a controversial mark, but on the other hand, we have to look at the results. What was the impact? And I think so that the impact was very positive, and it really did develop in a way that we'll see it even help the Jewish people to develop such types of institutes as it was developed by Bishop Shlomo Michael Alexander.
One of Alexander's objectives was to complete construction of the Protestant church which CMJ was building on its property. However, when Bishop Alexander arrived, the foundational construction of the church had only just begun. Both the bishop's presence and construction of the church engendered opposition from the French, Austrians, and Russians, who saw themselves as the guardians of Catholic and Orthodox interests. Opposition also came from the Turkish authorities because the building of a new church contravened Islamic law. For the British, this was now a matter of national pride. Britain had assisted Turkey in regaining control of the land of Israel in 1840, and Turkey owed Britain a favor. What Britain wanted was a Protestant church. A compromise was reached. Permission was granted for the building of a Protestant place of worship, the only stipulation being that it had to be the private chapel of the British consul.
The church was dedicated on the 21st of January 1849, 7 years to the day since Bishop Alexander entered into Jerusalem. But Alexander never saw the completion of the church. He died suddenly in late 1845 en route to Egypt on his way to England. What Alexander achieved in his short life in Jerusalem was immeasurable in spiritual terms. Alexander, himself a former rabbi, saw his task as being a shepherd to the small band of Jewish and Gentile believers in Jesus in Jerusalem. From the time the church was completed in 1849, daily services were held in Hebrew, the original language of the Bible. Throughout this Gentile-looking neo-Gothic style church are Hebraic inscriptions and Jewish symbols.
representing how Gentiles and Jews are brought together as one new man, both grafted into the same olive tree, the olive tree representing God's covenant promises to Israel. The belief system of CMJ and Bishop Alexander, as represented in the architecture of Christchurch, was that God is going to restore his ancient covenant people Israel once the fullness of the Gentiles had been realized. They were not alone in their belief. It was shared by many British Christian leaders of the time.
Within the Anglican Church, not only amongst evangelicals, but even amongst the broad church and the high church as well, or the high church party as it was sometimes known, that there was widespread, across the board support for seeing the Jews return to Palestine. The source was the Bible and how biblical ideas and the influence of the biblical text had so influenced British society. And England had been thoroughly, since the days of Oliver Cromwell and the days of the Puritans, had been thoroughly influenced by the biblical text, and people, Christians of all denominations, but especially within the Church of England, started to identify with the characters in the text.
Prominent Baptist minister Charles Haddon Spurgeon, preaching in 1855, declared,
"We do not think enough of it. But certainly, if anything is promised in the Bible, then it is this. I imagine it is impossible for you to read the Bible without seeing clearly that there is an actual restoration of the children of Israel. Thither shall they go up. They shall come with weeping unto Zion, and with supplications unto Jerusalem. May that happy day soon come. For when the Jews are restored, then the fullness of the Gentiles shall be gathered in, and as soon as they return, then Jesus shall come upon Mount Zion to reign with his ancients gloriously. The day will yet come when the Jews who were the first apostles to the Gentiles, the first missionaries to us who were far off, shall be gathered in again. Until that shall be, the fullness of the church's glory can never come. Matchless benefits to the world are bound up in the return of Israel. Their gathering in shall be as life from the dead.
Israel's restoration and the glorious return of Jesus the Messiah are divinely connected. Whatever you believe about the end times, you won't want to miss our next episode of CrossTalk. Till next time, shalom, and prepare your hearts to receive the blessing of the Cyrus Call.
Because he loves me, I will follow him. Because he loves me, because he loves me, because he loves me, I will follow him.